Have you ever felt like your mere presence bothers people? Not because you said something wrong or acted with hostility, but simply because you were yourself. No masks, no need to please. In certain places, you don't have to shout to make others uncomfortable. All it takes is refusing to bow, not laughing at things you don't find funny, not agreeing with what you find absurd. The silence of someone who thinks differently often echoes louder than 1,000 voices repeating the same thought. Nietzsche knew this. That's why he said the world hates those who refuse to obey. We live surrounded by invisible structures demanding conformity, standards of behavior, imposed morality, social rules that cannot be questioned without being labeled arrogant, difficult, or problematic. But is obedience really a sign of virtue? Or is it, in many cases, just fear? Fear of being judged, rejected, excluded. Because deep down, being free is an offense to a world built on repetition. True freedom, the kind that starts within, as a visceral rejection of pretending, is seen as a threat. And not without reason. When someone decides to be honest with themselves, they reveal what others try to hide, that they live according to others' expectations. The refusal to obey exposes the cowardice of those who follow rules without knowing why, who shape their opinions based on what the group accepts, who need applause just to feel alive. The free person makes others uncomfortable because they don't need an audience. Nietzsche understood there's a subtle kind of violence in the demand for obedience. It's not about chains or physical restraints, but a constant pressure to stay silent, to adapt, to shrink yourself. The world fears those who break from that because they function like mirrors. They expose what no one wants to see, that freedom requires courage, sacrifice, clarity, and that most people would rather enjoy the comfort of a cage than take on the responsibility of thinking for themselves. So if you've ever felt this discomfort simply by existing, you're not alone. You're just free in a place where everyone has been trained to obey. Nietzsche never trusted traditional morality. To him, the idea of virtue we're taught from a young age didn't come from nobility, but from resentment. In On the Genealogy of Morals, he maps out a dark path. The values we now consider good, like humility, obedience, submission, were created by the weak, not as a celebration of goodness, but as revenge against the strong. Kindness became a kind of disguise, a subtle strike. If I can't be like you, I'll turn your strength into evil and my weakness into purity. That's how obedience gained the status of virtue. This mechanism started with slave morality. Slaves in the symbolic sense, those who feel powerless, oppressed, and secretly envy others' freedom. Instead of confronting that impotence, they built a value system where resignation is praised and rebellion is condemned. Courage became arrogance. Autonomy became pride. Boldness became sin. Slowly, we were trained to believe that being obedient is being good, but no one asks, good for whom? Morality, in this view, is a tool of control. It doesn't guide us toward goodness. It domesticates us. We're praised when we lower our heads, when we follow the line, when we don't question. The better you adapt, the more likely you'll be labeled as exemplary. But if you challenge things, you're branded difficult, selfish, or dangerous. Nietzsche invites us to look beyond this. He asks, are you really good or just well-trained? The culture of obedience didn't take over through force, but through seduction. It presents itself as ethics, as spirituality, as a path to peace. But in many cases, it's just fear disguised as virtue. It's the renunciation of your own judgment, the suspension of critical thinking in the name of supposed order, and anyone who tries to step outside becomes an anomaly. Because questioning the roots of morality isn't just philosophy, it shakes the very foundation that holds the herd together. Being free in this context isn't just about disobeying external rules, it's realizing that many of your convictions were implanted, and having the courage to ask, do I truly believe in this? Or did I just get used to obeying? Nietzsche didn't write to please. He wrote to shake people awake. And one of the most disturbing images he gives us is that of the last man. This figure isn't cruel or wicked. In fact, he's harmless. He spends his life chasing comfort, safety, small pleasures, and social approval. He no longer wants to take risks, to suffer, or to become more than what he is. He just wants to be like everyone else, equal, predictable, domesticated. And that's exactly why he marks the end of human greatness. The last man is the final product of herd morality. He runs from pain, avoids conflict, and distrusts anything that requires effort or depth. He's traded autonomy for stability, his thoughts for prepackaged opinions. Freedom terrifies him because it implies responsibility. It means looking at himself and confronting the emptiness that appears when there are no more rules to follow. Faced with that, he chooses obedience, not out of virtue, but out of fear. Nietzsche saw this figure as a degeneration of life, a tired, worn-out spirit that prefers comfortable mediocrity over the risky intensity of freedom. And here's where the real problem starts. When someone dares to step outside this pattern, they don't just threaten the social order, they disturb the emotional safety of the herd. The presence of a free thinker is unsettling because it forces others to ask themselves, what if I'm just hiding? And no one wants to face that answer. That's why those who refuse to obey are discredited, labeled as crazy, egocentric, radical, not for what they do, but for what they represent. A break from the norm, a crack in the consensus, a reminder that living on autopilot might not be real life. The herdman doesn't hate the authentic out of malice, but out of defense. He needs to protect his closed world from any sign of possibility. And here lies the paradox. The closer someone gets to inner freedom, the more dangerous they become to those who are trapped. Because their very existence proves there's a way out. And those who rely on crutches can't stand seeing someone walk on their own 2 feet. Obedience isn't just a moral demand. It's, above all, the foundation of social coexistence. In a world where everything must operate with precision, where each person plays a predetermined role, obedience guarantees predictability. It prevents chaos, reduces conflict, keeps the wheels turning. But at what cost? The same order that protects also imprisons. The same stability that soothes also drains vitality. Often, the price of harmony is the death of spontaneity. From an early age, we're taught that obedience is the safest path. Those who question too much are labeled insolent. Those who choose their own steps are viewed with suspicion. A system has been built where being well adapted is seen as success, even if that adaptation comes at the cost of one's soul. And what's most curious is that this obedience is rarely enforced through direct violence. Most of the time, it's internalized as a virtue. The individual learns to police themselves, to trim their own impulses, to repress their most intimate truths for the sake of acceptance. The German thinker saw this as a sign of cultural weakness. To him, real strength wasn't in following orders, but in creating one's own path. Rather than settling for ready-made answers, the free spirit longs to understand, even if it leads to discomfort, conflict, or solitude. But this search for authenticity destabilizes the silent pact of society. Because when someone refuses to obey, they're not just making a personal choice. They're exposing the artificiality of the rules that others follow without question. The figure who breaks from the social order reveals another way of existing, and that makes people uneasy. It shows that the system might not be natural or inevitable, that obedience might be a choice, not an obligation, and that beneath the appearance of peace, there's a silent emotional cost, the suffocation of the self. It's not easy to deal with that. That's why those who are different are often pushed to the margins. Not for being violent, but for being true. In a world where everyone has been trained to bend, the one who remains upright looks dangerous. Obedience doesn't come out of nowhere. It's taught, cultivated, repeated like a mantra from the earliest years of life. The child who questions too much is scolded. The one who follows rules without hesitation is praised. Little by little, we're shaped by a subtle but relentless pedagogy, an education that doesn't form free individuals, but subjects trained to accept, to fit in, to stay silent when something feels wrong. School, instead of awakening thought, often becomes the first laboratory of domestication. The philosopher viewed with suspicion those institutions that preach morality but demand submission. It's no coincidence that he fiercely attacked educational systems, religious structures, and political systems alike. To him, there wasn't much difference between a pastor's sermon, a politician's speech, or a teacher's lecture that won't tolerate being questioned. In all of them, there's a hidden message. Don't think for yourself. Follow the path we've already drawn for you. Traditional religion taught for centuries that salvation comes through obedience. That doubt is a sin. That humility is a virtue, even when it turns into self-denial. Politics, in turn, sells freedom as a promise, but demands absolute loyalty to the very systems it created. And deep down, all these structures share the same desire: to keep the individual under control, to reduce their potential, to neutralize their ability to disrupt the order. The free spirit is seen as a problem from the start, because they ask questions that have no easy answers, because they don't accept "it's always been this way" as justification, and because, even in silence, they carry in their eyes a spark that threatens everything designed to keep the masses at peace: the will to live on their own terms. This pedagogy of servitude works largely because it's dressed in good intentions. It disguises itself as care, as guidance, as protection. But the result is an army of souls afraid of themselves, who avoid the mirror, who trade truth for comfort. And when they see someone breaking that cycle, they feel attacked, as if the other's freedom were a personal insult. To be free in this world is a silent crime. And like any crime that threatens the system, it must be punished. Even if the punishment comes in the form of isolation, disdain, or invisibility. Society doesn't need prisons to punish those who break the invisible contract of obedience. There's a much more effective kind of punishment: emotional isolation. When someone thinks differently, acts unexpectedly, or simply refuses to accept certain norms without questioning them, they aren't immediately confronted. They're slowly silenced. Mockery, veiled contempt passed off as humor, subtle exclusion. It's not a direct attack, but a gradual erasure. That's the price paid by those who don't bow. It doesn't matter how just or serene someone's stance is. If they stray from the collective path, they become a target. And not necessarily for what they do, but for what they represent. The mere fact of not needing external approval is seen as arrogance. The courage to live by one's own truth is labeled egotism. Integrity becomes insolence. Because anyone who dares to be whole in a fragmented world ends up being mistaken for a threat. The German thinker claimed that real freedom is not the absence of external chains. It's the inner readiness to be hated, rejected, and still remain standing. And that may be the cruelest part. The solitary rebel isn't necessarily at war with the world, but the world wages war against him. Not because he's an enemy, but because his existence reveals a flaw in the system, a crack in the facade of unanimity. The different one pays dearly for refusing to conform, not with physical violence, but with the weight of indifference, with eyes that look right through them, with conversations where their opinion is ignored, with spaces where their presence is tolerated, but never truly welcomed. It's exile without a name, a punishment that leaves no visible marks, but eats away from within. And yet, it is from this marginal place that true freedom is born, because the one who survives silence learns to hear their own voice. The one who endures exclusion finds within themselves a deeper presence, and the one who doesn't kneel before the will of others begins to walk on their own, even if it's down lonely paths. They walk among us with the upright posture of those who refuse to pretend. They are silent, but their silence echoes like thunder. They have no intention of confronting anyone, yet their mere presence is destabilizing. Because by carrying the weight of exile, by resisting domestication, they become dangerous. And it's precisely that danger that signals the birth of something new. A type of human being who no longer lives under the rules of the herd, nor bows to the applause of the obedient. It's at this point that the most provocative image of the one who dared to think against the current begins to emerge: the overman. Not a superhero, nor a superior being in the usual sense, but someone who has broken with slave morality, who has destroyed within themselves the need to please, and now lives from an internal center, without asking for permission to exist. They do not obey, not out of stubbornness or vanity, but because nothing outside them is worthy of blind submission anymore. They have become their own law, their own measure, their own standard. This figure doesn't seek acceptance, doesn't long to belong, because they understand that every attempt to fit into molds created by others is a form of self-mutilation. What they want is to create new values, new ways of living, new ways of being human. Their path is solitary, not because they hate others, but because most people still wouldn't be able to walk beside someone who abandoned the old maps. They do not lead crowds. They simply light the way for those ready to see. There's no romanticism in this path. What there is strength. A strength born from direct confrontation with emptiness, with anguish, with the absurd. They pass through it all without guarantees, without rewards, because they know that true greatness isn't about being recognized. It's about being faithful to who you are, even if no one applauds, even if everything around you tries to convince you that living authentically is a mistake. And so, this being who walks at the edge of the crowd slowly becomes a sacred and unsettling presence. They demand nothing from others, but simply by existing, they force people to ask themselves whether they are truly alive or just obeying out of habit. But living like this comes with a cost, and it's not a small one. Those who decide to break free from the invisible chains of obedience don't find peace right away. They find the desert first. Solitude isn't a metaphor. It's real, dense, cutting. Those who leave the herd don't step into blooming fields. They step into ruins. Ruins of old certainties, of friendships that couldn't handle the difference, of bonds that only existed as long as there was submission. Freedom isn't a promise of comfort. It's an invitation to clarity. And clarity at times hurts like an open wound. There are days when silence weighs more than any scream, when the absence of belonging feels like a cruel punishment. And that's when many ask themselves, is it worth it? What's the point of so much effort if all it brings is rejection, misunderstanding, and sideways glances? But that's the trap. The world tries to make the pain of authenticity feel like failure, when in truth, it's the sign that you are truly alive. Because only those who rip themselves from rotten roots feel the ground tremble. The thinker who inspired this path never promised a happy ending. He didn't sell success formulas or offer spiritual refuge. What he offered was something else: intensity, authenticity, truth. And that can't be found in comfort zones. It only reveals itself to those willing to bleed a little to be whole, to those unafraid to look inside and see everything they left behind for the sake of acceptance. Because in the end, what's gained is not tranquility, it's depth. This is the solitary path, walking among ruins and still standing tall, refusing shortcuts, enduring the void, holding your presence even when no one else sees your worth. It's not about pride, it's about dignity, not about superiority, but about integrity. Because for some, obedience is simply impossible. It would be the same as betraying their own soul. And perhaps, right at this point, a deeper question begins to emerge. Can the truth even be spoken? Or does the world need lies to keep functioning? Truth, contrary to what many believe, does not illuminate. It burns. It doesn't comfort. It exposes. And for that reason, it's almost always unwanted. In a society built on masks, repetition, and convenient narratives, telling the truth is like turning on a light that's far too bright in a room where everyone prefers the shadows. It's no surprise that those who dare to name what is hidden are seen as threats. Lies bring people together, soothe and reassure. But truth separates, unsettles, and destroys illusions that once felt safe. That's why the obedient are promoted. Because they don't make waves. They repeat what they were taught, believe what's socially acceptable, praise what's trendy, and never ask questions that could endanger the system. They are the ideal citizen, predictable, polite, domesticated. But the one who thinks for themselves is a problem, because by saying what no one wants to hear, they reveal just how much everyone else is sustaining a theatre, and no one likes to be reminded that they're acting. The German thinker understood this dynamic with fierce clarity. To him, truth is not a goal for everyone. It's a destination for the few who can bear it, because it demands courage. And courage in this context is not epic bravery. It's the willingness to live without the comforts of lies, to not hide behind social rituals, to not seek approval for every move, to truly become free, even if that means being hated by those who chose blindness as a way to survive. This is the great irony. The more sincere someone is, the more they tend to be excluded, not because they lack love, but because they hold too much truth. The presence of the authentic is like an unfiltered mirror. It shows what's hidden, exposes hypocrisy, reveals the silent agreements of collective pretending, and that hurts. It hurts so much that it's easier to push away the one who speaks the truth than to face the lies that uphold daily life. In the end, truth is always lonely. But for some, it's the only path possible, because to live lying to oneself is too high a price, even if the lie brings company, praise, and false peace. And yet, despite the weight, there is a kind of redemption, not the kind promised by doctrines or institutions, but a redemption that arises in the heart of the individual who decides to turn their life into creation. When someone breaks free from a social role and begins to live as the author of their own existence, something changes profoundly. Every action becomes expression, every choice becomes language, every step a declaration. They no longer live to meet expectations. They live as if sculpting a work of art from their own soul. This is where the power of the disobedient is revealed, because even while being rejected, they bloom. Even when misunderstood, they remain true to themselves. Even without an audience, they dance. And this solitary dance is, at its core, a rare kind of victory. That of someone who doesn't need to defeat anyone else, because they have already overcome themselves. This person isn't interested in applause. They want intensity. They want to live fully, even if it hurts, even if the entire world says it would be easier to fake it. Life, at that point, is no longer a sequence of identical days. It becomes continuous creation, authentic expression, constant risk. It's no longer about being accepted, but about being real. And even if the price is high, it's paid with pride. Because there's no greater dignity than being whole, even if others see that as a mistake. There's a calm strength in those who choose themselves, an untamed beauty in those who refuse to betray who they are. But it takes courage. Courage to lose connections that only existed while obedience lasted. Courage to be hated by those who loved your submissive version. Courage to let go of the safety that comes with the herd. Because deep down, it will all come at a cost. The world will always demand that you kneel. But if you resist, something new begins to emerge. A freedom that doesn't depend on acceptance. A peace that doesn't need permission. A dignity that no one can take away. And maybe, in the end, this is the true measure of a life worth living. The ability to stay standing even when everything around you tells you to fall. The courage to meet your own gaze in the mirror, even when others turn away. The strength to remain alive, even if that means walking alone. Because freedom is not a gift, it's a conquest. And the world only hates those who dare to remind it of that.